Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Lama Murad. I'm an assistant professor at the Norman Patterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. And I'm also proudly a founding executive member of the Arab Political Science Network, which is one of the organizations that is leading this webinar today. I'm really delighted to welcome you all to this, the first webinar in our series, which is focused on the politics of transition in Syria in a comparative perspective, and which we're really proud to co-host in collaboration with the Arab Reform Initiative. But before we begin, I just wanted to sort of put out some quick reminders and a bit of housekeeping. The first, as you would have heard, is that today's session is being recorded and will be made available online at a later date. Unfortunately, it will not be live streamed today, but in the future, we may be doing some live streams as well. We are offering live Arabic interpretation. So if you'd like to listen in Arabic, you can click on the bottom of your screen. There should be an icon that says interpretation. It's like a little world map. And you can select your preferred language there. We have a live Arabic interpreter with us and who will be doing that, and we'll be doing it as we speak. And the other point to highlight is that please to not use the chat for questions, but you can feel free to post your questions at any time, and we'll get to them in the latter part of the discussion using the Q&A button in the Zoom toolbar. So if you put your question there, we'll be drawing from them from the discussion. I'd first like to introduce the two organizations that are behind this series. The first, as I mentioned, is the Arab Political Science Network, which I'm a member of, is a professional network dedicated to supporting connecting political scientists from and working on the Arab region. Our aim is really to create an inclusive, accessible space for critical conversations, both on research and teaching, and to amplify voices that have often been marginalized in both academic and public discourse. We're also pleased to be partnering for this series with the Arab Reform Initiative, which is an independent think tank that supports locally grounded research and dialogue on democratic reform, governance, and accountability across the Arab world. In our chat, you'll find links to both organizations if you'd like to know more about our work. The series that I'm introducing today really emerges from the recognition that in moments of political transition, we often have more questions than we have answers. And many of the questions that we have are sort of intertwined and part of a broader network of issues that are both urgent, deeply contested, but also fundamentally fraught and have many different intertwined issues related to them. So our aim, though, fundamentally is to center Syrian scholarly expertise and to put it into dialogue with comparative cases and experiences that allow us to unravel some of these issues. Importantly, though, this is not really meant to be a series that produces ready-made policy solutions or provides answers that are sort of one size fit all, but rather the goal is to situate Syria within a broader global conversation that asks what comparative scholarship can offer Syria, but just as importantly, what Syria can teach us about the politics of transition. So today's session is the inaugural one. It's focused on post-war Syria and the paths to stability. And it takes up, a very central challenge, but not the only one, of sort of post-conflict governance and rebel rule in Syria. I'm very pleased to have an expert moderator on this issue today to introduce our speakers and to lead us in the discussion, and that's Salam Saadi. Salam is a PhD candidate in political science at the University of Toronto, a former colleague of mine at the University of Toronto, and an incoming postdoctoral fellow at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard University. His research is focused on authoritarianism, minority-led regimes, and the political economy in the Middle East more broadly. So I'll pass it over to Salam, and thank you all again for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lama. I am really delighted to welcome all of you to this webinar today. As you all know, it's been 5 months since the fall of the Assad regime, and in the aftermath, of course, Syrians across the country experience a profound sense of relief, joy, and hope. But now, as the dust begins to settle, new and growing challenges are emerging. And if there is one thing scholars and experts tend to agree on, it's that the political road ahead for post-conflict states is extremely challenging. There is often deep skepticism about whether genuine stability, inclusive governance, and long-term peace can take root after a civil war, and of course, Syria is no exception with that regard. After a couple of months of relative stability and what initially looked like a smooth integration of armed factions into the new Syrian military under the government led by Ahmed al-Shara, the country has witnessed several episodes of renewed conflict and violence, and these have taken the forms of widespread violations and major atrocities committed by some wartime factions. In early March, these events targeted the Alawite community, and last week, similar violence struck the Druze majority areas of Suwaida, southern Syria, Jaramana, and Sahnaya near Damascus areas. And these incidents have shown just how little control the new government and its leadership exercise over armed groups that have nominally accepted integration into the formal Syrian military, the new Syrian military. Of course, achieving stability means confronting this fragmentation of these armed groups and finding ways to either effectively integrate or demobilize them. But that's obviously easier said than done. So today we have a fantastic panel with us with deep expertise to share their insights on exactly this issue. We will be exploring how post-conflict governance in Syria might navigate the challenges of military and security reform, strategies of integrating or demobilizing non-state armed actors, preventing a return to conflict and violence, avoiding authoritarian entrenchment, and finally, what lessons can be learned and drawn from other contexts, transition contexts. So let me briefly introduce our esteemed panelists in the order they will be presenting. Rahaf Al-Doghli is a lecturer in Middle East and North African Studies at Lancaster University. Her research examines nationalism, sectarianism, and political attitudes within authoritarian contexts. Rahaf's book, Romanticizing Masculinity in Ba'athist Syria, Gender, Ideology, and Identity, was recently published with Manchester University Press. It examines gender and identity formation under the Ba'ath rule in Syria. She has also written and published extensively on Syria in a variety of journals and media outlets. Our second speaker, Jerome Driven, a senior analyst at the International Crisis Group. He received his PhD from Durham University and previously held research fellowships at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies, the University of Oxford, and the University of Manchester. Jerome has conducted extensive research on armed groups in conflicts in Egypt and Syria. His recent book, From Jihad to Politics, How Syrian Jihadists Embraced Politics, was recently published by Oxford University Press. Next, we have Kai Thaler, an assistant professor of global studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Kai's research examines civil conflict, political violence, security, state building, democracy, and authoritarianism, with a focus on Africa and Latin America. His forthcoming book, When Rebels Win, Ideology, State Building, and Power After Civil War, will be out this December from Cornell University Press. The book looks at how wartime ideology shapes state building by various rebels, and his work has been published in journals such as Comparative Politics, Journal of Democracy, Journal of Politics and Security Studies. And last but not least, we have Sally Sharif. Sally is the Simons Foundation Canada postdoctoral fellow at Simon Fraser University and a lecturer in political science at the University of British Columbia in Canada. Sally's research explores how governments, international organizations, and third-party states manage various forms of political violence, from repression, co-optation, and containment to peace building and conflict resolution. I should say that Kai and Sally have made an extraordinary effort to join us today. It's 6 a.m. in their time zone, so we are really grateful for your presence. So we have 90 minutes for this session in total. Each speaker will have around 8 minutes to present. After that, I will pose a few questions to the panel, and then we'll open it up for audience. So as Lama said, please, if you have a question, please use the Q&A function. I'll try to get to as many as possible. With that, let's go ahead and get started. And as I said, we'll begin with Rahaf.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Salam and Lama, for organizing this and inviting all of us together to speak today about Syria. Actually, I want to start I am someone who for the last 4 years have focused on armed groups and specifically on fighters' motivations, like the rank, the lowest rank in these armed groups. And so I focus on fighters' emotions, fighters' narratives, and fighters' grievances. I want to start the talk with a few points about the security sector now, or the fragility of the transition period in Syria. I will start with a few questions about how do fighters understand victory when the state they fought to dismantle collapses? And also, can a political transition succeed if it fails to address the lived experiences, grievances, and revolutionary subjectivities of those who carried the conflict and were part of these various armed groups? The third question is, what happens when the institution tasked with ensuring stability inherits not just the hopes of a revolution, but also its deep fractures? So one of the challenges that the current authority or the current leadership in Syria faces is not only the kind of the proxiness of the past of Syria for the last 14 years, like the different regional dynamics and the kind of the rivalry among these different stakeholders, but also fighters' grievances at the bottom rank. Now, I want to start we see that while the fall of Bashar al-Assad in December 2024 marked a historic turning point in Syria, yet actually we need to admit that there is deep fragilities both within the rebel alliance that toppled Assad and within the newly emerging security institution that's tasked with governing the post-Assad state. Now, drawing on my recent field work with commanders and fighters, as well as insights from Syria's evolving political and security dynamics, I want to argue today that Syria's new political military order remains precarious, not because of military weakness, but because of unresolved grievances, fragmented loyalty, and fragile institutions that risk reigniting instability. First, I want to highlight that the coalition that brought down Assad was forged by pragmatism and not by political unity. Historically, groups like the Syrian National Army and Hayat Tahrir Sham operated independently and often clashed. So they were divided by different ideologies, territory, and foreign patronage. Their cooperation during the deterrence of aggression campaign emerged out of necessity and not convergence. Now, although Ahmed al-Shara formally, Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani succeeded in unifying these factions under his leadership, it was a tactical achievement and not the birth of a national consensus, which are for example, we have major groups such as the SDF and southern factions, including those based in Dar'a and Suwaida, remain outside this order, which kind of exposed Syria to critical gaps in national cohesions. Second, I want to point to that despite the victory speech in January 2025 by Ahmed al-Shara announcing the dissolution of all factions and the integration of rebel groups into a new Ministry of Defense, actually the security sector today remains highly fragile. For example, over the past few months, the Ministry of Interior has rushed to recruit thousands of new personnel with minimal vetting and almost no political re-education. Several incidents of sectarian violence, particularly in the coastal areas, have already surfaced, reflecting actually a lack of a command structure in the Ministry of Defense and weak civilian oversight. This fragility is compounded by the loyalty-based appointments that dominate the new military leadership. For example, prominent posts in the new army have been filled by figures whose main qualifications is personal allegiance to al-Shara or to HTS rather than merit or broader acceptance. Actually, in one of my articles, recently published in New Lines magazine, the report key divisions such as the new Republican Guard and the Damascus military divisions are now commanded by figures with controversial wartime histories, including foreign nationals whose presence raises sovereignty concerns. This approach actually deepens resentment among former fighters and communities who feel marginalized from the new order that they helped to create, and they were revolutionaries for the last 14 years. Also, I want to differentiate between two layers of grievances that threaten Syria's fragile security sector or fragile transition. On the one hand, for example, we have deep-seated communal wounds, especially between Sunnis and Alawites, rooted in decades of state violence and instrumentalization of certain sectarian identities. On the others, I want to highlight that there is divisions amongst Sunnis themselves, especially among these armed groups, where factionalism and competition for political and economic dominance continue to breed the mistrust. For example, the Ministry of Defense has failed to address either. So there has been no serious efforts to build a systematic tawjih ma'nawi. I've read like 2 days ago that they have started to actually, but this is too late. There is no comprehensive political, ethical, restructuring of fighters' emotions and their ethos, which is so important to forge a national identity that rise or goes beyond factional and tribal loyalty. So instead, currently, fighters continue to carry their pre-2024 identities as members of different factions, tribes, or regional networks, which are still not having, the Ministry of Defense does not have a one command structure. And this is partly related to the complex regional dynamics. For example, the SNA fighters or groups who were SNA belong to the Syrian National Army. Till today, they are still receiving their salaries from Qatar and Turkey, and this actually kind of weakens Al-Shar'a's ability to have a command or a command on these groups. Fourth, and perhaps most dangerously, the absence of a credible transitional justice framework, which has opened the door to dangerous forms of informal justice. I've heard, and there are some documented incidents where few groups, security groups from former fighters in some of these armed groups are now taking justice into their hands. So we have seen groups who are tasked with killing ex-regime's followers, and this is dangerous because it tells us that there is a deep security gaps, and there might be these groups might be the next spoilers in Syria. So, as I said, over the past few months, there have been credible reports of targeted attacks against ex-regime followers, which carried out without any judicial process, fueled by personal grievances and a desire to avenge atrocities committed during the war. Actually, these developments represent a profound threat to any prospect of building a lawful and rights-based order. I want to hint also, there is a fixated revolutionary identity among these fighters where their identity fuses with the grievance and there is no institutional path to justice. So revenge becomes the substitute, and this cycle risks plunging Syria into renewed cycles of violence outside any official state authority. Also, I want to hint that that the new political military order faces the critical external pressure that further complicates stabilizations. We have many different stakeholders, regional and international actors are still trying or vying for more dominance after the fall of Assad. We have still SDF somehow backed by the US. We have still Turkey using some proxies like the Syrian National Army, and we have a new actors trying to have a role in the new Syria. I want to conclude with that the fall of Assad ended one chapter of Syria's long tragedy, but it did not create the foundations for stable governance yet. The alliance that achieved success remains vulnerable to fragmentation, and the security sector, while growing rapidly, is deeply unstable. Grievances persist, transitional justice is absent, and a dangerous culture of revenge is beginning to take root. I want to call for a few actions, actually, not trying to cover everything or to solve the problem, but I think we need to have a transparent transitional justice, which is kind of establish an independent transitional justice council, and that kind of define what kind of war crimes, because fighters and commanders from SNA are fear marginalization and fear retribution because of the war crimes that they committed. Also, we need to build institutional loyalty and not only loyalty based on certain persons or certain armed factions. We need also symbolic recognition, publicly honor all revolutionary factions so they don't feel that they are marginalized, and honor their sacrifices. Dignity must be visible and inclusive. Lastly, we need to go beyond merit-based, we need loyalty-based appointments, and we need to have instead merit-based appointments, like which follows credibility across revolutionary constituency and not loyalty to dominant factions. Lastly, we need to create a civic identity, like create an independent mechanism for accountability to prevent informal revenge network. I will stop here, and I hope I didn't speak more than 8 minutes. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rahaf, for this really great overview of the major challenges facing the Syrian transition. I will now hand it over to Jerome Driven.
Hi, first of all, thank you for the invitation. And thank you, Rahaf. I think what I'm going to say is going to be very much complementary to what was just said, which, is important to show that we analyze challenges very similarly. So first of all, when we look at Syria, I think we have to first take consideration of what are the forces in presence. So when we speak of the armed insurgency, as was mentioned earlier, we speak of different forces. So the main one really is HTS and its allies. So those were the former Al-Fath al-Mubin operation zone. So since 2020-21, they've totally restructured their military forces, they improved their training, coordination, and they fought with one another for 4 years. And all of the other groups that are with HTS have basically agreed to be led by HTS in Idlib, and now they are forming the core structure of the security forces and of the army inside Syria. Then the second main force are the SNA. So when we speak of the SNA, despite being called an army, we speak again of a plurality of groups. Some of them are more or less embedded locally. Some have been involved in criminal activities in the past. Others are based on more narrow ethnic sub-identities. So those are far less cohesive and far less organized, but also they had antagonistic relations with HTS in the past. Sometimes HTS used some of them to fight others or to infiltrate the areas in the north of Aleppo that this group used to control. And in addition to that, there are really the autonomous groups. So the largest one are the SDF, obviously in the northeast, but then also some smaller groups, like those in the south, that agreed to participate in the operation to take over Damascus and to take control of Syria, but they don't have the same history of coordination and integration with HTS and its allies. So then, when we want to understand what is going on in Syria, we have to understand, first, what is the plan of the government, what the broader objectives that the government has been trying to achieve for the past few months, and how this contrasts with the reality on the ground. Because you might have a bigger plan, but then reality does not allow you to transform it into a reality. So the government's plan really is to have a united army. So the idea initially was to say, we are going to dismantle all the groups, which officially happened, but in practice those groups remains. But in theory, it was to dismantle all the groups to integrate them in different structures in the army according to their strengths, specialization, the qualification of their soldiers and of their leaders. Ideally, the first step would be to have them in new divisions that the government would create, and then potentially to include their leaders in different positions within the army. Then, over time, the army would recruit new soldiers, create new divisions, expand, which would ultimately dilute the role of the factions. So that was how HTS started, but this is facing very important challenges. The most obvious challenge is money. The government is still under sanctions internationally. So those sanctions are affecting Syria as a state. So those are sanctions that were affecting the regime, but are still affecting now the new authorities. The government is also sanctioned because of HTS itself. HTS remains listed as a terrorist organization by a range of states, by the Security Council. Also, many of the foreign fighter groups that have integrated the HTS over the years are also listed. Some of the group's leaders are listed. Ahmed Ashara is listed, is Minister of Interior, Anas Khattab is listed, and some other commanders. So it means in absence of revenues, the government cannot really incentivize the groups into diluting their forces into the new army because it can't pay for their salaries. So as mentioned by Rahaf earlier, HTS continues to pay its own soldiers, but soldiers from the National Army are still paid by Qatar through Turkey, which means that not only those revenues are less important than what HTS members get, but also it means there is no centralization of resources. The second issue is that the whole construction of the army is somehow disconnected from the political process. So we saw the beginning of a political process with the National Conference, with the Constitutional Declaration, with the formation of a new government, but that does not directly impact the security sector because the government and the Minister of Defense, for example, think that by creating a new army from scratch, basically from zero, they can just get the buy-in from all the factions by simply promoting their leaders in different positions in the army. But the issue that once you do that and once you cut the leaders from their soldiers, you might further marginalize their leaders who might end up losing everything. And by not connecting the construction of the army with a political process that would also give somehow a position to different factions, also based on their representativeness, based on what they've done in the past, and so on, you create tensions that ultimately mean that some of these groups might decide not to go along with your decisions. And so that's linked to the third issue. The third issue is that as the government continues to be quite weak because of the absence of resources mostly, it largely has to forego most of its plans. So what we see in reality is that despite the official claims that the armed groups have dismantled, they're mostly staying the same. They are becoming divisions, but in practice they are very much autonomous, which means that many of the actions that were committed recently, including the massacres on the coast, including some of the clashes now with the Druze, are committed by groups that officially the government claims are acting within the Ministry of Defense, but in practice are acting autonomously. So the government starts being blamed for actions that is not fully responsible for, simply because it does not exercise full command and control over them. And that also means that in the meantime, the government has to accept de facto giving a position to groups, but even some of their leaders, that are very controversial. Many commanders of the National Army, for example, are sanctioned internationally for some of the crimes that were committed in the past. But now they've been integrated as head of divisions, as generals or other positions within the army, which raises a lot of controversies for the international community, but for Syrians as well, considering what was committed by some of these groups. And so it means that not only you can't control them, you can't discipline them, but you're giving power to very controversial figures. And instead of disciplining them, at best, the government can move them in different areas to lower their capability on the ground and their possibility of disruption, but that's not very much sustainable. And to a large extent, the same logic applies to foreign fighters. When we speak about foreign fighters, we don't speak about many people. We speak at best of a few thousand, probably up to 5,000 people. And half of those are probably from the Turkestan Islamic Party. in addition, there are also foreign fighters from European countries, Arab countries, Central Asia, Russia, and so on. In the past, HTS's approach was to purge the ranks of the foreign fighters by eliminating those closer to Islamic State and to Al-Qaeda, and to force their integration into HTS's own military forces. But now it's becoming an issue because some of these fighters, I mean, all of the fighters theoretically have joined the army, and some of their commanders have also been promoted. For the government, it's a way to reward them to some extent, but also to control them. But this is not how it's perceived by many foreign countries, who see it as, the promotion of listed individuals into a new state army, which they find very problematic. Also, there is an issue also in terms of political integration of the Alawites. The security forces and the army linked to the regime have dismantled. Other communities are trying to find a position within the state, but there is for now little space for Alawites per se. The Alawite issue is mostly seen under the security as a security issue, so to prevent a new insurgency and to find potentially some collaboration with local leaders, but there is no real discussion about their integration politically within the new Syrian state, and partially what it means with regards to their integration as well within the security forces. That doesn't mean that former regime officials have to join the army, but there has to be also an Alawi presence within the new state. And now Syria is at risk in the sense that the sanctions are still affecting the government, affecting its ability to restructure its security sector and its army. The recent killings, both in the coast, but now against Jews as well, are making foreign countries even more reluctant to leave them, thinking that it could be used as a further leverage to get some guarantees from the government. And that means also that foreign countries could become more reluctant to even support the restructuring of the army. There are real issues with the government, including the authority and control of former HTS and has reflected in the constitution, but the absence of support by foreign countries and a weak government would mean that the new authorities would be even less likely to prevent potential new clashes and killings against civilians. So for now, when we think of the construction of the army and the construction of the security services, those are very much ad hoc decisions that the government is taking based on the evolution of the situation. I think that what would matter would be to have a clear political pathway that integrates both discussions on the nature of the state within discussions about the new constitution, the inclusion of Syria's plurality of constituting parts, and how this fits with both the nature of the threats that Syria is facing and the type of army and security services that have to be built in response. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerome. We will now turn to Kai Thaler, who will share a comparative perspective from other cases of military and security integration and efforts to build stability after conflict.
Thank you, Salam. So some of this will follow on what Rahaf and Jerome were talking about before, and hopefully also lead into what Sally will be discussing as well. So around the world, rebel victory has resulted in widely varying types of states and levels of regime durability. Some rebel victors are never able to seriously consolidate power, like recently in the Central African Republic. Others create very long-lasting regimes, like in Cuba, China, or Mozambique. One recent finding from Killian Clark and Meng and Jack Payne suggests that a key determinant of regime durability is whether there's one cohesive rebel organization or coalition, or the armed opposition is highly fragmented. Fragmentation can make regimes much more likely to collapse. This is not always the case, however. Sometimes, like in Angola, one rebel movement can gradually consolidate its power against others who have been active at the time that the old regime was displaced. And as discussed by others already this morning, one key factor in establishing stability is the relationships and potential conflicts between HTS, the SNA, and other armed actors. Within a new governing coalition, having centralized command of military power can help entrench authoritarianism. But if you have continued autonomy among different commanders or networks, this can fragment power. It can potentially lead to coup threats from within the government, to mutinies of security forces, to localized or potentially spreading violence, as we've already seen in Syria, or even new rebellions. So far, Al-Shara and HTS have been opening up the transitional government to other actors rather than directly seeking to govern exclusively. This can help other groups in society feel like they have a stake in the new government and an opportunity to address their interests without resorting to arms. And that can lead over the longer term to inclusion and genuine democracy. This was the case in Nepal after the Communist Party of Nepal Maoist won, though in part that longer term democracy was due to divides in the communist movement itself. So it may be in some ways that a lack of cohesion in the governing coalition longer term can lay the groundwork for democracy, but it can also lead to continued conflict. A post-war coalition government sometimes, though, may be a way to make other groups complacent before centralizing power further and then excluding them. So this would be what we would see if HTS was just using inclusion as a facade to, over time, consolidate more control for themselves. Nicaragua's leftist Sandinistas initially had a governing junta, together with more conservative civil society actors, who eventually resigned when it became clear where the actual power lay. And we can see this to an extent in Iran as well, in how conservative clerics behind Khomeini and the Revolutionary Council, while not exactly having led a prominent rebel group, shared power with the provisional government until they were able to push out moderates and use the Revolutionary Guards to sideline the military. The same can apply to divides within an organization, where different factions or leaders may initially share power and influence while consolidating power before one moves to further assert control. We've seen this in Afghanistan after the Taliban's 2021 victory. The Kandahar-based hardline side of the group overcame other members' initial push for slight moderation. Now, a number of different factors have been suggested that might determine the way rebel victors will govern, the state they will rebuild or construct, things like natural resource availability, territorial control, civilian constituencies, and ethnic divisions. My own work argues that the extent to which these factors affect governance tends to be downstream of rebel organizations' ideology and what vision they have for what society should look like and who the state should serve. Even when rebels have access to natural resources, have a limited social base or little experience controlling territory and governing, or when they face international political or military pressure, the ideology they establish as rebels gets reinforced by institutions they build in the organization, by their ties with civilians, helping ensure they stick with it once they're in power. Groups who want to transform society need to try to build the state's reach across territory and throughout the population to achieve that. Others, though, may be content with only controlling the capital and economically critical areas. Some organizations primarily want to benefit themselves and only narrow constituencies, like their co-ethnics. Others may have ideologies that call for serving all or the majority of citizens. And an organization that wants to try to transform society, that wants to serve more of the population, is going to need to try to build out the state's influence and establish a stronger state with a chance for medium to long-term stability. state, though, is likely to be more authoritarian, and its repression may eventually lead to a new uprising. But if you have purely self-interested groups, that leads to more instability in the short term. Turning to international factors and how they might matter for the Syrian case, there's questions around Turkey's involvement, Israel's escalating intervention. So some work argues that international actors and influences can be decisive in shaping the type of state and governance that result after rebel victory. This may be the case where there's direct international military intervention to facilitate rebel victory, or there's a peacekeeping operation. However, rebels often defy their sponsors, and rebel victors frequently defy international pressure. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, the AFDL, which was a fairly loose rebel coalition that was brought together by Rwanda and Uganda, they turned against their Rwandan and Ugandan backers once leader Laurent Désiré Kabila was in power, instead seeking support from other countries in the region. So HTS will not necessarily remain aligned with Turkish interests. Foreign military threats can also lead to greater cohesion among rebel victors and strengthen the regime. So Israeli intervention could potentially unite the new government and much of the Syrian population. But if internal divides remain deep, it could contribute to a protracted conflict instead. HTS's Islamist ideology has evolved over time in a somewhat more moderate and inclusive direction, though still seeking some societal transformation and a different model of the Syrian state, although still a presidential one. I'll leave it to experts like Jérôme and others, Rahaf, to say how sincere and deep any ideological moderation has been and what the current balance of power among groups in Syria might mean for the future of the state and governance. And I'll look forward to the discussion and to learning from all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kai, for this fantastic overview of different comparative cases. Finally, let me turn to Sally Sherry.
Hi, thanks a lot for inviting us, Salam and Lama. This is a wonderful panel. I'm very excited. I just have to apologize. I have a bit of a cold and my voice is not great today. I want to draw on some research, some collaborative research about rebel victories across the world since the end of the Second World War, and I also want to draw on some of my own research about disarmament and demobilization of armed groups today. I'll be touching on 3 points. The first is why rebel victories struggle to consolidate the state. The second is the challenge of disarming rival factions. And the third is the need for credible amnesty and constitutional guarantees if disarmament were to go through. So in a collaborative project with Madhav Joshi at the University of Notre Dame, we gathered a data set of all the rebel victories that have happened since the end of the Second World War. And we argue that rebel victories face this unique legitimacy challenge. This is because when rebels win, or coalitions of them win, it is not the case that they necessarily have control over the entire territory during war. So they always have pockets of opposition around the country, or areas that have been under state control, where people might not be very happy with rebels governing. And because rebels take over the state and they sort of take over this entire pie, the moment victory happens, it sort of signals this idea that if the state is so weak, then it is up for grabs. So if the whole pie can be won by one group or a coalition of groups, then this could be done again. So there's this idea that if the state were to fall once, then it could also fall a second time. And this creates incentives for internal opposition groups to arm and try to contest the power of the state. So there are these major legitimacy gaps, and we find that interestingly, rebel victories might be very stable and very resilient once rebels win, but they are not they're not resilient to armed challenges domestically. So having said this, that there is this legitimacy gap, we seek to understand what rebel victors can do. So once the rebels win over the state, what can they do to reduce the chance of renewed civil war? So what we're basically very interested in is recurrence of war. And we theorize sort of 4 ways that rebels can govern when they face this armed opposition within their borders, something that Syria is facing today. The first thing they can do is they can repress. They can take out the leaders of these groups. They can carpet bomb territories that support these groups, etc. So repression is the first method. The second method is they can sign power sharing agreements, just like what we have seen President al-Shara do, bring sort of leaders of other groups and give them ministerial positions or give them positions in the military, so power sharing. The third method is signing a peace agreement with them. And we probably know that last week there was a peace agreement that was signed with the Kurdish forces. This has to do with regional dynamics with Turkey. And I do not want to get into that part of the story because it's beyond my expertise. But signing a peace agreement is one method to sort of try to placate these internal armed groups. The last method is to sign a peace agreement that involves constitutional reform provisions. So this is when the government signs a peace agreement with armed groups, but then says there are provisions within these peace agreements that have to facilitate a constitutional reform process. So the constitution of the country will have to be rewritten, but with input from the armed groups. Now, we sort of analyze the data on, like I said, all the rebel victories since the end of the Second World War, and we find that the first few methods either do not work or they actually increase chances of recurrence of civil war. So this is very interesting because in the literature, in the political science literature, we sort of understand that a few things might help. Signing a peace agreement should help with stopping the renewal of war, or power sharing agreements might be perhaps helpful, although this idea is contentious. But then we find that in the case of rebel victory, perhaps because of those legitimacy gaps that we identify, these methods of sort of creation of peace or methods for consolidating the states do not necessarily work. In our analysis, the only thing that works to stop the renewal of war is constitutional reform. And not just any kind of constitutional reform, but negotiated constitutional reform that is based on consensus. So when there is a constitutional writing commission that includes actors from a variety of sectors, including representatives of armed groups. Now, why is the Constitution so important? So why is it that we care so much about the Constitution? Obviously, when rebels win, they try to change the Constitution very quickly. When the Taliban won the first time in 1996, they put together a panel of 14 Islamic scholars, and they put them behind closed doors in one room, and they said, come up with a constitution in a very unilateral fashion, not really asking for input from the rest of society or other armed actors. These scholars came up with an 18-page constitution that was modeled after the constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And but that constitution never went into effect. And then the US intervention happened in 2001, and that constitution never went into effect. But we also find that these forms of unilateral constitution writing sort of increase the chances of civil war. So why do we care so much about a negotiated constitutional reform process and not just a unilateral one? This is because when you ask armed groups to disarm and sort of channel their fight through politics and not through armed rebellion, they require guarantees for their safety. In my own research, I put together a data set of all the disarmament and demobilization programs in the world since 1980. There have been about 86 of these. So between 1980 to 2020, there have been 86 of these programs. And I look at under what conditions these disarmament programs fail and the armed groups rearm. And the one factor that I find to be the most important in determining whether armed groups go back to war is provision of amnesty. So if rebels or militia groups find that they put down their arms, but they do not receive amnesty or they do not receive security guarantees from the state, then they're very likely to rearm. So in the history of disarmament demobilization, like I said, since 1980 to 2020, 51% of disarmament programs have failed. So rebel groups or their factions have rearmed. So disarmament might sound easy, as in, let's call all groups to bring their arms and give them up and have the state collect them. But then there are always arms caches and there are always hidden depots of arms, which allow rebels or armed groups to go back to armed rebellion. So the reason we emphasize constitutional reform is because it is only through a negotiated consensus-based constitution that includes amnesties and representation of all sectors of society that rebels will have these security guarantees to put down their arms and not retake them. So if you think about long-term peace, we will have to not only disarm the armed groups, but also make sure that they do not go back to war. The other reason constitutional reform and negotiated constitutional reform is important is that when rebels win, like I said, the first thing, their main concern is changing the constitution because they do not want to govern with the same constitution of the ancien regime. And in a recent paper that I worked on with colleagues from the University of Pittsburgh, we find that when rebels win, they add provisions to the constitution that sort of curtail property rights. So rebel regimes or rebel incumbents are more likely to give everybody carpet property rights. So to say everybody in the state, every private person in the state has access to property rights. But then they're also more likely to add these clauses in the Constitution that say, yes, everybody has property rights, but the state is allowed to take their property away if it is in the general public interest. In these very vague terms, rebel regimes add these clauses to the Constitution that allows them to expropriate private property from people. So when constitutions are not negotiated, they create these very unstable institutional frameworks that do not facilitate the disarmament of armed groups and do not facilitate transitions to peace and might actually take the country back to war because the security guarantees for disarmament are not present. And then the institutional framework, which Rahaf talked about, is not present and is not negotiated. So I just want to say a few words about the current situation in Syria. What we saw in the first year, in the first few months of Ahmed al-Shara's government, was not good news. So when I, as a political scientist, look at the events in Syria, it does not surprise me that violence has come back. So when, unfortunately, 1,000 people die in Latakia, it does not. When I look at these events, it does not surprise me because the new government in Syria has taken all the steps that our analysis shows points to renewed civil war. Jerome pointed to stacking the government, the ministerial positions with people that have allegiances with HTS. Rahaf talked about the fragmentation of this group and the challenges of control, and Kai talked about sort of the shift from coercive to non-coercive methods of governance. And all of these things are sort of the textbook formula for recurrence of war that we see in our analysis. So the last thing I want to say is, if we were a few things that the government could do right now, it would be to shift from coercive to negotiated security integration, to pair this disarmament drive, this request for armed groups to put down their arms, with a comprehensive, legally entrenched amnesty, and to launch an inclusive constitutional process, unlike what Ahmed al-Sharaa is doing, which is having created a commission that does not include others, that decentralizes power, guards property rights for minorities, and allows them to move on with the amnesty program. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally, so much for this wonderful overview of different types of power sharing and their effect on the outcomes of different transitions. And thank you, everybody, for these fantastic presentations. So I'll get this discussion started. I think I have a question for Rahaf and Jerome, and then another question for Sally and Kai. So my question for Rahaf and Jerome is on how to deal with the SDF forces and the factions, armed factions in Suwaida. So you talked about difficulties and challenges mainly emerging from dealing from Al-Sharaa coalition, basically the coalition of the Syrian revolution, the armed groups that fought against Assad. But when it comes to the SDF and faction in Suwaida, three probably options or scenarios seem possible. Al-Sharaa might try to co-opt these groups, confront them militarily, or accept a de facto reality where he lacks control basically over parts of Syria. So in your assessment, which of these outcomes is most likely, based on whether all the challenges that you mentioned, structurally really important major challenges, but also Al-Sharaa personality and leadership?
May I start, or Jerome? Okay, so I think, thank you so much, Salam, for this question. And I think to me, I mean, it's a very difficult question as well, because there are challenges for Al-Sharaa even to accommodate SDF with the complexity of the regional dynamics. As I said, like US is backing SDF. We have ISIS prisons in the Kurdish areas. But also, I think there have been mistakes committed by the new government, like the Al-Hiwar al-Watani, the national dialogue that never included any of SDF forces. And I think also what Sally said is very important in terms of including central commanders in these kind of negotiation process, whether in the national dialogue and also in the constitutional reforms. And all of this, like in the last 5 months, like Al-Sharaa did not approached SDF as a mukawin or as part of the different national communities or communities in Syria. We see a hasty agreement, and I think because of what happened in the coastal areas, that Al-Sharaa was pressured to sign that peace agreement with SDF. But we do know that SDF will never kind of disarm itself unless that there is like the US somehow pressure them to do so. And so this failure of the political process, and I think even when today we focus on the security reforms, there is also that there is a need to integrate that security reform with a real transparent political process. So the failure of including Kurds or also Rijal al-Karama, for example, in the national dialogue was kind of endangers the national consensus or the social contract amongst in the new Syria. And I think so. Not only the regional dynamics is complex, but also al-Shara and the new leadership committed these kind of further reinforced the marginalizations of Kurds and Druze in Syria. And I think the next step, I think, in my recommendations in many policy reports that I have written lately, I do recommend that we need to restructure the Ministry of Defense, calling for a representative military council where we are talking, we've missed officers, the defected officers, for example, they were marginalized. They are not part of the Ministry of Defense, so we have marginalization there. We need to have a representative military council where, for example, SDF commanders, there is also Druze commanders, SNA commanders, all present in restructuring the security sector or the new national army. This is first step, and also I want as I said, fighters and commanders are scared, even if they were appointed. To give an example, like Jerome said, like Abu Amsha is even, Saif Abu Bakr is scared of being given to be imprisoned again, even when they held high appointments within the new military. So there is a need to have a clarity about what kind of transitional justice that we need to have in Syria. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Rahaf. Jerome?
Thank you for this question. Yeah, I think when we look at the SDF and Suwaida, but generally speaking, the armed groups, I mean, basically we have two main models. You know, what the government wants is to have like a cohesive army. So basically, you know, you dismantle all the groups and you have control over everybody. But obviously, others disagree. So, for example, even the SDF and the government agree that the SDF's military forces have to join the army. But the issue is how do you integrate it as a more or less independent bloc, which means that the SDF keeps control over its soldiers, but the SDF becomes a part of the army, but only on paper? Or do you dismantle fully the SDF and you mix them within the army? Obviously, the most efficient is to have a cohesive army whereby all the groups really dismantle and don't integrate as blocks. But then the issue for these groups is to say that that type of army would become then the army of the presidency if there is no share of power. So you could have a cohesive army, which is better to set up security, to reconstruct the state and so on, but then it becomes an army that is in the hands of HTS. So they find it hard to accept. So basically all these discussions about the SDF, about Suwaida and so on are ultimately linked, because if you start making concessions to one, others will ask concessions. So you make a concession to the SDF, the SNA will ask for a concession to join also as more or less independent units. People in Suwaida will do the same, and so on. So I think the government is really pushing to go against this solution, but I think that reality is also imposing itself on the government. And in practice, the government is making increasingly a range of concessions to those local groups because it simply does not have the choice. So for example, if the government was only facing one group, let's say Abu Hamsha or Hamzat or whatsoever, it could confront it. But that's not the case at the moment because it does not control all these range of groups. So it can't confront them all at the same time. And if it makes one concessions to one, it will have to make concessions to the others. So I think this is the direction that it's taking, more in like de facto decentralization of security, which is not something that it wants, but it's something that it simply has to accept because it can't confront them and it can't even incentivize them because it doesn't have money. So reality, I think it's setting up in a way that the government might not like, but is just what is going on.
Great, thank you so much, Jerome. So the question for Sally and Kai is on basically the negotiate agreement and this and power sharing agreements versus implementation. So the effects of these agreements, disarmament and military integration programs on civil war recurrence and return to violence are basically mixed, if you agree. Often because, or probably because, agreements are like either poorly designed or poorly implemented also, right? So if you can comment on these two dimensions, like the implementation of these arguments. Sally talked a lot about different types of power sharing agreements, but if you can comment on the implementation of these agreements on the ground, I'm not sure if you can apply that to the Syrian case. And Kai, if just a little bit expand on the issue of ideology and vision, that was really interesting. So what aspect of ideology and vision you think is important for the transition, if you can clarify that?
Right. So this is a hard question. They say the devil is in the details, and you're absolutely right that once a peace agreement is signed, then the hard work of implementing it and translating those provisions in the peace agreement into public policy, that work starts, which is very difficult. What we know from implementation of peace agreements is that number one, peace agreements that have a robust support from international actors, such as the UN, are more likely to be implemented successfully. And I believe that the current president's sort of distance from the UN and other international organizations is slightly harmful to the peace process or to state consolidation. For instance, if there is a disarmament process, I agree with what Jerome said, which is that we cannot integrate all the fighters into the military. Number one, that would sort of create a bulging effect, and the state might not have the resources to support these fighters, these combatants, once they are integrated. The second thing is that a lot of militia groups, when they're integrated into the army, they maintain their own identity. They cannot be fully integrated into the army, and sometimes they rebel, which is what we see in Sudan today as the civil war restarted once the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, were integrated into the military. So integration is not necessarily the answer. The other side of the coin, if you decide not to integrate, is to disarm, demobilize, and reintegrate, to do DDR, which was one of the questions that one of the members of the audience posted on the Q&A. So DDR processes require a lot of international backing. In these programs, the World Bank is involved, giving loans or creating projects for combatants, helping with the post-conflict economy to raise sort of people's, generally communities from poverty, and then allow certain opportunities for combatants so they do not revert to war. So implementation is very difficult, but what we know from the political science literature is that some peace agreements are more likely to succeed in terms of implementation than others. So the design stage is also very important. I agree with Rahaf that this peace agreement, this agreement that was signed with the SDF last week, it has only 8 points. It's very bare bones. It is not very clear who's doing what. It's not like there's no detailed timeline in terms of what is going to be implemented. The SDF keeps maintaining that they are not going to disarm, whereas the agreement says that there's going to be institutional sort of cohesion of the central government and SDF. So it's very vague, and we know, if anything, from the literature, that peace agreements that are vague in terms of their provisions or are not comprehensive, so they do not include everything, such as providing amnesty, transitional justice, constitutional reform, executive reform, electoral reform, legislative reform, etc., they are more likely to fail. So it is true that implementation will be difficult, but then in the design stage, there are certain concerns that have to be taken into account, and especially with how people are involved. Input from different sort of sectors of society are involved in the design stage. That will sort of foreshadow how the agreement is implemented and whether it will be successful in bringing about peace.
So I'll echo Sally here on this point that she made, that implementing peace agreements, issues around security sector reform, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, in the absence of strong international guarantors, is very difficult because it's hard to build trust among different actors, to agree to put down their arms, to, believe that if we give up our autonomy now, that we will, as Jerome was saying, not just become a tool of the presidency, we can still represent our own community's interest and protect them. And I think this is, also, as Sally raised, the issue of a lack of international trust or engagement with Al-Shara and HTS potentially being a problem. This is something that Jerome and his colleagues raised in Foreign Affairs a few months ago, trying to take a lesson from Afghanistan, and the refusal to engage with the Taliban, treating them as illegitimate, potentially being a lost opportunity there to not totally reshape how they were going to govern, but lead to a somewhat less extreme eventual government that resulted. So ideology does matter there if you are going to have some form of international engagement, or as other groups are trying to advocate for their interests. There are going to be some concessions or some issues on which an organization with a deeply held ideology will not compromise. There may be others where they're more willing to make concessions. I am not by any means an expert on HTS or any other Syrian rebel group, so I will not try to speak to what exactly those issues are where they might be willing to compromise, and those where they might be more willing to bring things around to this other aspect of peace agreements integration that Ahaf raised, and that has been raised in the Q&A as well, of transitional justice. In general, the sort of literature on regime transitions, both after civil wars and in transitions from authoritarianism, suggests that a pacted transition, something where all actors in the political system feel they still have a stake in the new government, where they're not going to be immediately thrown into jail for past actions. This is more likely to lead to a stable transition. The problem, of course, is that it's often an unjust transition, where actors who have committed atrocities remain in positions of power, may remain in positions of having significant military power, which they can abuse. Even if they don't wind up abusing that, in the long term, this can lead to discontent among the population about continued injustice. It can lead to citizen distrust of the government. And so you see in a number of Latin American cases where you had these pacts and amnesty agreements, eventually, over time, people grow very sick of it. When there's openings in the political system, they are sometimes able to push for actual transitional justice, but it will tend to be very politicized, where a new government will come into power. They will have a political reason for trying to use the transitional justice process to sideline other actors who they see as political rivals, and it avoids kind of a true situation of just justice. So in the short term, what might be most feasible is some sort of Truth and Reconciliation Commission that can try to catalog what has happened, and help people feel like they have a voice. Their experiences have been documented, but the sort of justice process resulting in trials, if it happens, would be likely highly politicized, and that might unfortunately be something that needs to happen further down the line.
Thank you so much, Kai. So we have many questions. I'll try to get as many questions as possible addressed to the panel. So one question, repeated questions, actually multiple questions on the international environment. If you can answer that, the role, basically the role of different international actors, Israel and the UN in the Syrian context, and especially how they affect the dynamic of the transition. Another question that's really interesting about local communities. How have local communities filled the governance vacuum by establishing informal systems of support and protection properly? And how might these grassroots structures function alongside or in place of state institutions and reshape the dynamic of transition if that's really happened in different communities because of the vacuum and security? And another question about probably Rahaf working on fighters, like rank and file and rank fighters. How can this question as it came? How can fighters' extremist ideologies undermine stability and transition in Syria? So, do you want to go first, Rahaf?
Do you want me to answer the international dynamics or the fighters' motivations?
Whatever.
Okay, I will start with I think because you posed a few questions, and I think the international dynamics was the first questions about the regional dynamics, right? Yeah, the regional the UN supervisions, to what extent the UN is involved. From my conversations with the MOD and some groups affiliated with the new leadership, they seem to be very reluctant of involving the UN. And that's understandable because actually in the last 14 years, the UN has failed Syrians. So we don't have a kind of good memory of UN acting for Syrians' different communities. And actually, some statements from the UN and the international actors are further dividing Syrians among themselves. So the focus of these international actors calling like for the protection of minorities have further actually divided Syrians among themselves and entrenched the sectarianized and emotionalized narratives in the area. So when we have that kind of international discourse that kind of gives certain recognizable rights to some groups, but not to others, that would create a kind of a reactionary statement from the current leadership by saying like we have been ruled by minorities, such as what Al-Shaybani, the foreign minister, said in a few weeks ago, and that's really dangerous. So I don't think the UN is having that kind of capacity or space to do the oversight, as what Sally's, for example, mentions in many peace negotiations process or post-conflict cases. Now, in terms of fighters' motivations, I think they do differ. So the different armed groups are not, they don't have a kind of one or unified revolutionary identity. Some of them, they were more of they fused their identity with the territory that they have, they control, which are their lands. So they have that kind of motivations to continue fighting. Others they are part of these armed groups are built on tribal networks because they are part of that tribal networks. Others, there is greed. Like there are some armed groups in Syria during the 14 years that greed actually plays a central role in defining their motivations. Also, what's really not mentioned is that the recruited fighters or in the last few years before the fall of Assad by Turkey to go to Libya and North Africa, these fighters who are fighting beyond borders are still stuck there, and we don't know how they will be coming back. So we do have, and there are quite thousands of numbers. We are not talking about few hundreds. There are thousands of fighters. So all of these are posing challenges. Now, I think briefly, before these armed groups consolidated توجيه المعنوي They signed Geneva Code. However, the socialization process of these fighters also among these various armed groups took different approaches. Now there is a real challenge to include, to kind of create a shared or kind of a contract among these fighters that help them move their fused revolutionary identity from that revolutionary subjectivity and make them shift into establishing or constructing a more of a political agency as part of the new national army. I think, but that will take time. It's not gonna, we have different motivations that kind of impacting fighters, or I may say now soldiers. We have deep grievances still, as Jerome mentioned, we have deep grievances among these different armed groups, and there are often more the new leadership is focusing on the central commanders, but not the file rank fighters. And though the file rank fighters might become spoilers or resisting the new leadership, which kind further complicates the security stabilization.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rahaf. Jerome, if you want to answer one of these questions, or we have other people asking about lessons from other cases in the region, whether Yemen, Egypt, Iraq, so whatever you feel comfortable.
Okay, I can go quickly. I mean, about the international environment, about Israel. I mean, to a large extent, Israel is trying to exploit internal divisions to basically keep the Syrian state weak for decades, potentially. I think that even if HTS was not in charge, even if you had quote unquote a more moderate group, I think Israel would still do the same because its objective is more targeting Syria as a state as opposed to only one group. The fact that HTS is a former jihadi group helps, but I don't think it's like essentially the reason. And at the same time, because of how Israel has been acting for the past year and a half, both in Gaza, in Lebanon, and also in Syria, the government has very little thing to do. I mean, they can complain at the UN, they can try to forge alliances in the region through Turkey, potentially also reaching out to Gulf countries, to Russia, and so on, but they cannot face Israel by themselves. It would be extremely naive to think otherwise. They're intelligent enough to know that the first bullet that they launch at Israel will be met with a massive, massive response, which they can't afford to tackle. So they have very little agency in a way in terms of their own response, and none of that includes a military response. Then in terms of the what were the I mean, one of the issues as well for the government, to a large extent, they have revised the ideology, their positioning towards society, and so on. But now they have to go beyond. It was very much led by the top, and the top is convinced by that. But that doesn't mean that all the fighters are necessarily convinced by that. It doesn't even mean that the radicalism of the fighters is necessarily jihadi. I don't think it's jihadi as much as Sunni. Part of it is Sunni pride. Part of it is getting revenge against Alawites because of what happened. So it's more sectarian than ideological, but it's something that they will have to target, and something that will have to be also addressed, as mentioned by Rahaf in the trainings. I mean, now they're building a new army. They also have to unify, what it means to be Syrian, what is national identity in Syria, what are they basically? We know that they are no longer jihadi, they're not Ikhwan, they're not Salafi. Okay, fine, but what are you? What is Syria? Where is Syria heading? Those are questions that they need to ask to respond, but not by themselves. They need to respond with Syrians. It has to be a consensus to create something consistent. And that's not something that will be easy to do. It will take years.
Thank you so much, Jerome. So we have less than 5 minutes. So Kai and Sally, 2 minutes for each. If you have any comment on whatever I mentioned, some people asked about sanctions. If you have any comparative perspective about sanctions in other cases, how they work, or international actors, or anything you want to add or comment.
I guess I'll just, picking up on some of what Rahaf and Jerome were saying about needing the rank and file to buy into whatever vision is being discussed among commanders, and at the top there's often much less ideological buy-in among the rank and file, or their ideas about what they're fighting for may be, or what an ideology means may be very, very different than what commanders say and present. And if you have people at the rank and file, at lower ranks, who have a clear vision of what they thought they were fighting for, and those at the top are making agreements that they feel go against that, that's where you're likely to see new mutinies or fragmentation. And so, to echo what they were saying, it is really important to either make sure that agreements are taking into account what people at the grassroots thought they were fighting for, or finding ways to reshape how they see the future and how they see their place in it, into this broader nationalist vision. When it comes to sanctions, there's huge debates about how effective sanctions are, in what ways they are effective or not. In general, if you have targeted sanctions against particular actors, it can constrain their action somewhat. It's unlikely to totally change what they were trying to do, and may often lead to backlash. And it also makes it possible for leaders to try to exploit nationalist sentiment, and argue that they're being subjected to international campaigns of interference. So it can actually increase their legitimacy, or at least give them an excuse for why they're not delivering on promises that they made, for why it's not possible to, actually make freedom or democracy what people thought it should be. And so I think that's something where a lot of care needs to be taken, and where, in fact, relaxing or removing sanctions tends to be more effective than maintaining or deepening them.
Thank you so much, Kai. We still have only 1 minute. Sally, do you have any final comment?
If there's only 1 minute left, then I would like to say there was a report a few years ago that sort of mentioned the 4 countries in the world that have been most affected by climate change. Those 4 countries are the United States, China, Syria, and Iran. Now, as a country that has been in war for almost 14 years, and the deeply the deeply rooted divisions that exist in society, and all the questions that I see on the chat, like what do we do with the Druze? What do we do with the SDF? What do we do with the foreign fighters? There are so many questions that are facing Syria, and I believe that perhaps we need to take a less than idealistic approach. Like, what is a perfect Syria going to look like? And I understand why there are temptations to do so, because we are building the state from the ground up in a way, or we are building the government from the ground up. Some remnants of the state still exist. But then perhaps a less idealistic vision of what is okay for now might be a better approach. And if I could make one suggestion, if I was sitting in front of the president of Syria today, would be that the president has been calling for foreign direct investment, for FDI, and investment by international actors to lift the economy out of the situation that it is in now. I want to say the international organizations, including the IMF and the World Bank and the United Nations, spent $300 million on disarmament demobilization in the Sudan. The US has spent $500 million on DDR in Afghanistan with the Taliban. Both of these programs failed. But then if you provide these constitutional frameworks, these guarantees for security for the actors, for the armed groups to lay down their arms, that is a very good way to attract foreign direct investment and international actors, getting them involved in providing loans, providing economic backing for integrating armed groups into society, and then actually lifting the economy in the process. So of course, you know, an ideal Syria would be very beautiful, but considering the challenges of climate change that will be long term, I suppose we need to go with what is feasible right now and what is right in front of our sort of eyes, and what is the one next step that can be taken that is feasible despite the multitude of challenges. And this is the way that I see forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. We have more questions, but unfortunately we're out of time. I would like to thank our speakers for this great discussion. We've heard thoughtful reflections on a range of issues really related to Syria and its transition. Thank you all very much. And I will now hand it over to Lama.
Thank you so much, Salam. I want to thank you for leading this discussion and you know, ushering us through what was definitely very thorough, but also you know, as Sally just alluded to, kind of one among a vast array of issues that Syria and many countries have had to tackle. You'll see in the chat, this is the first of what we hope is a really thorough but still limited, because you know, that's just the reality of these times, series that will cover a number of different issues. The next one on our docket is on political institutions and transition. There were a number of questions in the Q&A around the Constitution, around transitional justice. And so please, if you're interested in those questions, you know, sign up for our newsletter. Both ARI and APSN will have it. And thank you again to all of the speakers. It was so wonderful to learn from you all, and I hope we can continue this conversation in the future in other forums. Thank you again, Saddam.